unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teachings. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understandings of the teachings and practice, it's offered on the basis of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this is done without the expectation of anything in return when the opportunity arises. And those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis, so please support their practice by giving what you can. Our speaker today has very generously offered to give her dana back to Great Tree, so you can go to greattreetemple.org and then hit the support button on the upper tab. So thank you very much, Victoria, for that. Our speaker today is Tori Montrose. Tori Montrose is a scholar of modern religion specializing in global Buddhism and Japanese religions. Her current research projects include the modernization of Buddhist education in Japan and female leadership in new Buddhist movements. In both her teaching and research, she's interested in the ways in which modernizing and globalizing forces intersect and interact with traditional religious groups. And the title of her talk for today is Buddhism, a Family Affair. And this is a very timely talk because we have family meditation tomorrow as well as a family retreat in June. So, an important topic for now. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. You all look so cozy with the blankets. I just wish I could be there in person to join you, and hopefully I will be again soon. Thank you to Tejo for the invitation to speak to you all today. My history with Great Tree is relatively short, but it's been really impactful for me. So it was a really a great honor and a pleasure to be able to have the opportunity to think through some of the things that I encounter in my life and in my work and see how I could communicate that to, a group of practitioners. This is my first time talking to a group of practitioners in this kind of role. Um, so bear with me, please, please be easy on me. Let's see. Can I share my screen? I have some slides. Yeah. Okay. Um, so it's been a minute since I did that. Let me go here, share. Um, okay, I have to send a request to do that. Okay. So I'm gonna share this here. Okay, wow, my desktop just got infinitely more crowded. Okay. Let me see. Um, I think I made it more complicated by saying just share the Chrome window. All right, let's see. If I move to slideshow, how does that look for everyone? Good. Okay, perfect. All right. As mentioned, the talk for today is a pretty simple title, just Buddhism, a family affair. I was trying to think about, how else to kind of hone in on what I wanted to talk about, but this kept coming to mind. Um, so I want to start because I haven't met all of you. I know some of you, but I haven't met many of you. I thought I would just share a little bit about my connections to this topic, so you have some context for who I am as a speaker and what the ways in which that might be um, kind of connecting to the topic. As a child, I grew up with Buddhism practiced in my family. My first trip to Japan was at 3 years old. And I had a few opportunities to travel to Japan after that, including after college. I spent 2 years in Kumamoto, Japan, teaching English in the JET program. Um, and even though in college I didn't think I would do anything with Buddhism or Japan for a career, my time in Japan changed that. And so instead of going to law school, I decided to go to grad school for Buddhist studies. So after I got back from my 2 years in Japan after college, I went and did a master's at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, and then from there went on to start and finish a PhD at the University of Southern California in East Asian languages and cultures. and I was specializing in Japanese Buddhism. So now I get to teach Buddhism and Japanese religion courses as a full-time job at Furman University. And I feel just every day immensely grateful and lucky to be able to do so. It's such a profound joy to get to introduce Buddhism and Japanese culture and religion to undergraduates. Oftentimes, this is, the first time they're encountering any religion outside of their own or any religion period. And so it's a really thrilling experience to get to do as a job. But I also bring my connection to this topic is also that I'm a mother of two young children. Some of you have met these rambunctious kids, ages 4 and 7, Rosie and Arthur. So anytime I'm talking about family, of course, my own family is front of mind, even if I'm not directly talking about them. So this is my connection to the topic today. And I wanted to start with a question that's rhetorical, and it's a flawed question, but that's kind of the part of the point, which is Buddhism a religion that values renunciation over relations? And really, I could have said renunciation over family, but I was looking for the alliteration of the two R's. So, is this a religion that values renunciation over relations? And the reason I ask this question, flawed as it is because in my own classes, no matter how hard I try to drive home the point that family has almost always been a major part of the Buddhist tradition, going all the way back to Shakyamuni, and we're going to talk about some of those early stories in a bit. Many students continue to cling to their prior conceptions about Buddhism as an austere, renunciant religion. And these are students often that come in saying they know nothing about Buddhism. And yet, there's a very persistent and kind of stubborn idea that this is, an extreme form of renunciation, it practiced in the Buddhist tradition through this renunciant through the renunciant tradition. So I think this is it part of the problem is it's difficult to demonstrate in the classroom what renunciation looks like, right? In the classroom, it's more abstract. We can read texts. I can show them films, but I think it's a lot harder to see in a classroom the ways in which, renunciation actually looks in practice. Um, but I think even those with lived experience struggle with the tension of this ideal of renunciation. Um, so I hope that today we can kind of interrogate that tension together. I want to do so by traveling back in time to the life story of Shakyamuni Buddha, and then we'll make a few stops at other points in Buddhist history. And finally, I want to explore what these questions and themes might mean for contemporary practice. Um, So one way to approach this question might be to, oh, let me start. I forgot to start my timer. Make sure I keep myself on track. Um, One way to approach this question might be to focus on lay Buddhist practice. And I think Daisho's talk here at Great Tree last summer on the question, what is householder Zen practice, is another great way to think about this. One could also look at this through the other lens of what is monastic Zen practice. But of course, as Daisho rightfully pointed out, the line between these two is not always so neat, right? So today I'd like to focus on the messy interplay between renunciation and family relationships, kind of like a Mobius strip between these two ideal types within the Buddhist tradition. Or you could also, later this came to me that we could also think of it as a yin-yang symbol. Um, so one way to start here is, let me share my goals quickly. I want to share some insights from the scholarly world on this question. So this is something I'm sort of easing into in my research. This is a relatively new aspect of my own research, but there are scholars for the last 20 years or so that have been looking into this question. And so I want to share some of their insights with you. And then I want to engage in some reflection on what it means to frame Buddhism as both a renunciant practice and a family tradition. Then I'd like to share my own observations on the way Great Tree embodies this message. Just again, in my limited time, the ways in which I think this is very, a great community to be talking about this with. And then I'd love to listen to your thoughts and questions on the topic. Okay. So, um, if we start with the life of the Shakyamuni Buddha, we pre-enlightenment, we actually can start all the way back before he was born, because Shakyamuni in the Buddhist texts, the telling is that Shakyamuni takes great care to select his mother. So when he's, not yet born, he is considering who would be the proper mother for a future Buddha. And so he chooses his mother, Queen Maya, who is married to King Suddhodana, and they are part of the Shakya clan, which is why he has his name Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. And there's a wonderful scholar named Pascal Engelmeyer who does really interesting work looking at Queen Maya and her story, sort of the story of her journey, her spiritual path. And she argues that, if you look at the text, there's kind of prehistories of Queen Maya, just as there are kind of prehistories of Shakyamuni Buddha. And Queen Maya makes a vow many lifetimes prior to becoming Queen Maya and the mother of the Buddha. She vows to become a mother of a Buddha. And so Engelmeyer argues that the act of mothering was a salvific path or a liberatory path that Maya, chose for herself, right? She wasn't a sort of coincidental figure in this story. And in fact, the karmic ties between Queen Maya and the Buddha, as well as really all of the Buddha's family members, are go extremely far back. So that's one way to think about how family plays in very early on, that the Buddha is thinking carefully about who his family should be. Um, then Shakyamuni marries Yashodhara and has a son, Rahula. And this is the part of the story that in my classes is always the hardest to reckon with because, of course, Shakyamuni, shortly after Rahula is born, makes the decision to renounce. So this is really the first place that we see a real tension between family and renunciation. And it's one that a lot of my students really never get past. It's very hard for them. So we sit with that. We sit with that question, that discomfort. Um, I do my best to both sort of honor that discomfort and also look at the sort of overall karmic trajectory of these figures to see, this kind of one way to look at it is a kind of short-term sacrifice for the longer-term goal of liberation. So we'll come back to that. But I just want to kind of earmark this as like, this is a spot where a lot of students, I think they dig in to this idea of Buddhism as an extreme, tradition of renunciation. And I think a lot of times it originates with this decision that Shakyamuni makes to leave his young family. Um, okay. Then if we look at the Buddha's post-enlightenment story, um, the story goes that he leaves, his family, he pursues the austerities and eventually settles on meditation under the Bodhi tree, achieves enlightenment, and he begins somewhat reluctantly, but he begins his teaching career with some convincing. And as his community of uh, early Buddhists are kind of following him, and as it's growing, word gets Kapilavastu, which is where the Shakyas live, the Buddha's family. And so King Suddhodana is kind of curious about what's been going on with his son. Of course, he's extremely disappointed that his son left, but he wants to know kind of how his son's doing, what's going on. Is he really a Buddha? So he sends these kind of emissaries to the Buddha's community to kind of get some information about what's going on and to bring them back. Um, and the emissaries keep going to meet the Buddha and then joining the Sangha. So King Suddhodana keeps losing his emissaries to the Sangha, but one eventually remembers his mission, and he does actually after he joins the Sangha, but he also convinces the Buddha to return to Kapilavastu to share the Dharma with his family, and so he does. So there's a lot of interesting stories in this kind of what I'll call like a family reunion, post-enlightenment family reunion with the Buddha. Um, so uh, his father, King Suddhodana, was initially reluctant, um, but ultimately does support his son as a lay follower. There's also what I find to be quite a moving story when the family, especially the elders in the family, are meeting the Buddha initially upon this reunion. The the custom is that all people should bow to a Buddha, and that they don't, they could face severe kind of karmic punishment for not doing so. But the Buddha knows that there's also a custom that, the junior family member should bow to a senior family member. And so the way the Buddha kind of compassionately skirts around um, this double bind is by levitating kind of above his family members so that his family members are kind of by default below him without requiring them to bow down to him. So there's this kind of already he's thinking about how he's going to navigate the family customs with the more religious and spiritual customs. Um, then we have a very funny and interesting story about the Buddha's half brother Nanda. The Buddha kind of tricks Nanda. Not kind of, I mean, he just full out tricks Nanda to joining the Sangha. He certainly is using skillful means in this example. He's he's sort of bringing Nanda along under false pretenses to kind of leave the household life, and then he finds himself kind of accidentally renouncing. It's a very interesting story. Because we never get to know the Buddha's side of the story. Why was this method necessary for Nanda? Of course, he does join the Sangha, and he has a good outcome, but it's an interesting story about skillful means and the different kind of methods that the Buddha is using for each family member. Um, then, of course, his cousin Ananda was the Buddha's attendant for much of his later life. In fact, Ananda becomes the narrator of the majority of Buddhist sutras. Um, so, in a lot of Buddhist sutras, when it says, "Thus have I heard," the the person that is saying that is Ananda. And so you really can't get any closer to the Buddha than Ananda. And he was so attached to the Buddha that he actually wasn't able to attain liberation until after the Buddha's death. And this, even upon, when the Buddha is in the process of passing away, Ananda is really one of the people that struggles the most with his departure. His son Rahula, the Buddha's son Rahula, joins the Sangha. There's one version of the story where Yashodhara, his mother, sends Rahula to the Buddha and says, um, "Go to your father and collect your inheritance." And so Rahula does, and he approaches the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Yes, I will give you your inheritance." And he um, gives him the precepts and essentially and adopts him into the Sangha. So I don't think that's the inheritance that Yashodhara quite meant at the time, but he does join the Sangha, and also Yashodhara does as well. Yashodhara is another family member that perhaps understandably is one that really struggles with his renunciation at first, but she does join Mahaprajapati's movement. and hundreds of other women in successfully petitioning the Buddha to allow women in the monastic Sangha. I know you had a speaker a few weeks back talk about Mahaprajapati, so I won't go too far into it, but I think that another interesting part about Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's aunt slash stepmother, is that when she passes away, as she's passing away, her death scene is very similar to the deaths of Shakyamuni Buddha. And the Buddha honors her during her death as a kind of female Buddha. She's given the name Gotami, which is a feminized version of Gautama. And so, she becomes, this matriarch. I mean, she already was a matriarch, but in is further elevated in her death to uh, to a kind of a female Buddha. So, um, this is a kind of laundry list of family members, but I want to point out that all of them that I've just discussed were said to have achieved liberation uh, and arhatship, I guess, with the exception of King Suddhodana. There's one story where Suddhodana renounces the throne, but for the most part, the understanding is that he remains a lay supporter. But all of them achieve liberation and arhatship. So, um, the Buddha is said to have lived over 80 years, and in these 80 years, he was only away from his family for a few of them, right? So, um, during the intense period of renunciation and ascetic practice, that's the part that's crucial, to his liberation is kind of working through, shedding layers of the self, disciplining his mind, etc. Um, but uh, I think we often kind of focus in on the renunciation part of the story, and we neglect the family reunion part of the story. Um, and I think while renunciation is often seen as a necessary step on the path to enlightenment, this focus on the renunciation and failure to see the return to the family gives us kind of a skewed view of the Buddha's ultimate lifetime, which was spent largely with family around him, albeit with transformed relationships, of course, once he becomes the Buddha. But nevertheless, his kin is around him, you know. So I think that's an important thing to think about. Um, and then, of course, after the Buddha dies, the early monastic community is, creating the canon and putting down the texts which started as an oral tradition, committing them to writing, and also formalizing the monastic codes. And so, in that too, we can see a lot of examples of this tension between renunciation and family, but not really in the ways you might suspect. So there's a scholar, Dr. Shane Clark at McMaster University, who wrote a really interesting book called Family Matters in Indian Buddhist Monasticisms. And in the introduction, he takes up this phrase that's often talked about with Buddhist renunciation, to go forth from home into homelessness. And he argues that while this phrase has generally been understood literally, it is best understood figuratively. And the way he explains that is he says that for the monastic legislators, the authors of Indian Buddhist legal codes, there seems to have been no question that monks and nuns could take their families with them into homelessness. Moreover, in texts which are commonly accepted as belonging to the earliest strata of Buddhist literature available to us, we find presupposed within monastic communities the existence of monks and nuns who were biologically related to each other. And then he argues, in my view, this throws doubt on the scholarly assumption that monks and nuns were required to forsake their families. So he goes into much greater depth and gives just really thorough treatment of these texts to illustrate examples and after examples. But this is a kind of one major takeaway, which is that at least on the scholarly side, this assumption that renunciation and family were sort of diametrically opposed is a false one. And he even connects it really interestingly to some of the kind of the formation of the field of Buddhist studies. He says in the 1800s, when Christian scholars were starting to pick up Buddhist text and study Buddhism as a religious tradition, many of them were they had kind of fixed in their mind the monastic ideal of the Benedictines, the Benedictine tradition of monasticism in Christianity. And so when they are reading Buddhist texts about monasticism, a lot of the kind of filter that they are pulling through onto these Buddhist texts is a kind of Benedictine ideal of monasticism, which you could understand might color their interpretation, especially if they, are not familiar with the living traditions of monasticism and Buddhism, if they're just looking at the text. So um, I find his work really interesting for kind of seeing the through line, not only of this model of Shakyamuni's family being present throughout much of his life, but even in the early monastic tradition after Shakyamuni, family continues to be a pervasive theme. And it is not the case that, that monasticism and familial relations were completely separate. Um, Jumping forward in time, there are two other scholars, Richard Jaffe and David Gellner, that look at married monastics and family temple traditions in both Japan and Nepal. Though in both cases, there are intense intra-Buddhist debates about this practice. So I don't want to make it seem like this is just kind of wholly accepted across Japan and Nepal. There's always been kind of fierce debate about to what degree Buddhism should be a renunciant tradition or allow marriage and other forms of lay practices in renunciant practice, but I think it's still nevertheless interesting to see in these two case studies across very different parts of Buddhist Asia. Um, and then there's some really interesting work also by Dr. Jessica Starling at Lewis and Clark College. Her recent book, Guardians of the Buddha's Home, um, is an ethnographic study. She does ethnographic field work with the True Pure Land Jodo Shinshu temple communities, focusing on the Bolmori. So Bolmori is translated as literally as guardian of the temple, but it refers to the spouse of the head priest of the temple. So, again, because many Buddhist priests in Japan are married, the spouse um, is has an important function as well, and often it's the wife. But I'm using spouse because in a few cases more recently we have examples of the spouse being a husband. Um, so she brings to light this central figure within Japanese Buddhism that have been largely overshadowed by the focus on the husbands and sons' roles as head priests. And her work helps us see the immense role that family relations play in temple governance, ministry, and sustainability. She explains in an interview rather, that she gave for Tricycle, the Buddhist magazine Tricycle, that family relations are the connective tissue of the tradition. They are what are sustaining the temples. And through Dr. Starling's in-depth interviews with these temple wives, you can see the amount of sacrifice and renunciation that these women faced in their vocation. It's truly remarkable. It's very moving to hear these women's stories. Also, in that Tricycle article that's informed by her work that shaped the book, there's this really, I thought, very remarkable image of Shin Buddhist women at a 1943 ordination ceremony. So, in other words, these are Bomori, or they were Bomori, and then all of their husbands were off at war. So, there was a huge vacancy for, the head priests of many temples were off at in the war, and so these women were ordained as head priests to fill in for their husbands. And so the way in which I think, her work is illustrating the kind of the ways in which family is drawn upon, and a kind of necessary component of many forms of or many aspects of Japanese Buddhism, I think is really interesting. And she also has this wonderful quote in that interview. She says, it's disappointing that in scholarship about religion, women's domestic activities are often held up as an example about how oppressed or contingent a woman's position is. The sense is that if she's not acting fully independently of her family, then her religious activities aren't significant. What happens when we look at what the women are doing? When we really look at what the women are doing? So, I invite you to take a look at that article or book if you have a chance. There's much more in there. But I raise her work in part because, of course, she's talking about family directly, but she's also pointing out that by looking at the family, we are also seeing Buddhism through the lens of women's lives much more clearly. Because, in the scholarly world anyway, for many, many decades, if not a century or more, the Buddhist studies world has primarily been focused on texts and male monastic traditions, which has tended to, you know, overshadow this other massive part of Buddhist practice and the Buddhist tradition. So this is one other way to think about when you look at Buddhism and the family, you're also elevating many women as well. Okay, and then I have one other book recommendation. So I won't do these stories justice, and they aren't my stories to tell, but I really recommend this volume that came out last year called Emergent Dharma, Asian American Feminist Buddhists on Practice, Identity, and Resistance. It's edited by Dr. Sharon Suh from Seattle University. Um, so many of the writers in this volume are not monastic Buddhists. I think you'll find that many of the stories contain really important themes of renunciation, of unwanted labels or identities, of ways in which Buddhism's public image has erased their voices as Asian American women Buddhists, of expectations of what it means to be a real Buddhist. So this is a kind of chorus of voices that have been historically marginalized in, at least in the scholarly world, but if not in the mainstream world as well. So um, I really, if you want to look more at what contemporary Buddhist women are doing, I really can't recommend this book highly enough. It's very moving. Um, so family plays a central role. There's, just to give you a few examples, um, from Jane Iwamura's annual family tradition of graveyard visits to Mihiri Tillekaratne's manifesto to Buddhist aunties as not just inheritors of tradition, but future ancestors that are shaping the tradition for future generations. Funi Shu's moving trans-Pacific deathbed rituals, Mushim Ikeda's beautiful discussion of holding her identities as a monastic and a mother close to one another. So there are many more in this book, but I just wanted to kind of shout that book out because it's really giving me a lot to think about, and it's deeply moving. Um, I also will just share quickly what I'm working on right now, and I don't I won't spend too much time on it, but I'm looking right now at the role of Buddhist daughters. So as I shared, there's been a little bit of research on Buddhist motherhood, Buddhist mothers. I shared Pascal Engelmeyer's work on Queen Maya. There's been others as well, but there hasn't been really a sustained treatment of Buddhist daughters. What does that? What does it mean, right? And when we think about it, there are many more women on earth that qualify as daughters, and arguably all women on earth qualify as a daughter, but only some become mothers, right? So when we look at Buddhist daughters, we're actually looking at a bigger um, sample of Buddhist women. And some of the things I'm looking at is the kind of important literary roles in Buddhist literature that daughters can play. that daughters serve an important symbolic function for female renunciants. So, in many traditions, a Buddhist nun or a female renunciant is known as a daughter of the Buddha. So, I want to kind of explore what that means on a symbolic level. And also, daughters fill countless social roles in Buddhist communities, many of which are cataloged by scholars like Jessica Starling and also in this anthology, Emergent Dharma. So that's kind of what I'm working on right now. It's still in very early stages, but I welcome any thoughts or insights into this topic as well. Um, Oh, of course, sorry, there was one more piece. The leadership, this is how actually I got into the topic, that leadership roles held by prominent Buddhist daughters. So I got into this because I was looking at new Buddhist movements, a couple of which are led by women or will soon be led by women. And so I was interested in female leadership in Buddhism, especially in these new movements. And so I'm also going to be looking at what does female leadership look like as from the perspective of daughters. Oftentimes, these leaders are daughters of founders of new Buddhist movements. Okay. So I want to return to this question. Is Buddhism a religion that values renunciation over relations? Um, so um, I hope by now I've sufficiently muddled the problematic kind of false binary between renunciation and relationships, but I also kind of want to address maybe why this matters. How does this serve Buddhism or Buddhist practice? I hope that many of you will be able to share a bit about your thinking on this, because I hope to learn from you as well. A lot of my work is about investigating where ideas about Buddhism in the West came from, the historical processes through which Buddhism's public image in the West and also in historically Buddhist cultures in Asia um, were developed. So I want to look honestly at what US Buddhism has tended to import and what it has a tendency to leave out. And I know from conversations with Tejo, this is something she's interested in too. Um, I think this question can also be helpful just for naming a tension that some already feel but don't have words for. I think it's also healthy to put the monastic and the family ideals under scrutiny without dismissing either of them. Um, and I think this question allows us to look at the lived stakes, questions around family, around intimacy, around community, and what that looks like, including, what is the bodhisattva vow in practice, right? What is not so much as an ideal, but what does it really look like in its kind of messy on the ground form? And I think in this way, when you think of this kind of Mobius strip, in this way, the bodhisattva vow becomes a resource in that tension. Um, and on a personal level, this question or this topic really, I'm someone who tends to uh, become like too analytical about things or overanalyze or over intellectualize things. And so this topic has been really practical for me because it's kind of helped me move out of always being in my head and into a little bit more of my heart, thinking about these things from a more heart-centered point of view. But I want to know what you all think. So I think in some ways this talk is a little bit preaching to the choir because if you're at Great Tree, you're already part of a really exceptional community that foregrounds families and women. Um, when I the way I first came to learn about Great Tree was through a colleague here at Furman, and she mentioned it. And I went to the website and I was immediately struck with the homepage because the idea that a temple's homepage would have practice as a tab and right next to it, family practice is, I don't know, I haven't done an exhaustive search, but I think actually probably quite rare to put family practice really so prominent on the front page. To not have it kind of tucked away as a sub practice, I think is really special. And even the images on the carousel, this is one, but many of the images on the front page carousel of images, show children, show families. And I think that's also quite rare. And so I was immediately very intrigued by the community before I even attended. But of course, very soon after, I was eager to attend, and I brought my kids. This is my daughter Rosie in front of the Buddha on the porch. And doing going to the family meditation Sunday um, was has been a really great experience for my family. We live about an hour and a half south, so we aren't able to get up as often as I like, but it's, I think, a very unique um, offering that Great Tree offers. And then I also had the wonderful honor of being able to attend the mountain seat ceremony, which I'm sure many of you also attended. But I uh, I brought my daughter with me, and I snapped this picture I wanted to just share because I think it really encapsulates some of the themes I'm talking about. This is Dai Sheen, who's he's a visiting priest from the Iowa, Nebraska area, and I had seen this small child kind of up and about for the earlier parts in the breaks between some of the rituals. But, at this point, this baby was just completely exhausted and resting. And I asked him if I could take a picture because it's not often that we get to see this, the pairing of these two ideals kind of in one image, right? This is someone in formal ritual gear in the middle, really, of a ceremony. This is during, I think, a transition, or maybe it was right after. I don't quite remember. But, very much in a kind of monastic, highly ritualized role, and also comforting a sleepy child. And so, we don't often get to see images like this, I think, at least in the scholarly world. And so I thought that might be a good kind of encapsulation. But I want to thank you for listening, and I want to know, what are your thoughts and questions on the topic? Thank you so much.
I have thoughts. Hi, Tori.
Hi.
Uh, Hi, my name is Jaja. Thank you, first of all.
Yeah.
Um, I first started sitting Zen in Houston at Houston Zen Temple some years ago. I remember after the first in-person sit I did, I had a very serious conversation with my aunt that night.
Mm,
And just having the Buddhist practice my mind from that morning with that talk helped me to better navigate the conversation. It was a very difficult conversation. And so I think about um, your question, renunciation versus relation. I think just even the principle of we practice compassion for ourselves, and then from that we practice it for others. That's already built in.
mhm,
And even the question of renunciation, like maybe even redefine renunciation.
mhm,
Mhm. Like we're leaving, sure, we can leave something behind, we can leave the judgment behind
mhm,
and bring in compassion, which
mhm.
then helps relations.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you for
you.
sharing. Yeah, that was very helpful to hear. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of this is Um, that's why I tried to kind of foreground that it's a flawed framing because, if you really unpack renunciation, we have a lot of baggage with this idea, right? And so some of our work is really just kind of grappling with what that baggage is and how that can lead to self-judgment or limiting ourselves. So yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm glad to hear that you had that presence of mind with your conversation with your aunt. That's wonderful.
I have a thought to share. I don't have any children, but I do have relationships.
Hmm.
And like something that like I think Daisho talked about this in his talk, and even Genjo talked about this in some of his nurturing mind talks, but like when you have relationships that involve caring for each other, whether that's a partner or with children, like that's like being having an opportunity to develop the nurturing mind in like a service sort of point of view, I think is like you couldn't have that if you didn't have relations. So it's like I think that like having relationships with people is like so integral to being part of the practice because otherwise what would you nurture? You know, I guess like nurturing yourself is really important, but I feel like the you know the like trying to nurture the universal self and have that kind of magnanimous and nurturing mind I feel like is really only possible if you have relationships to practice that with. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, I think there are very few hermits in the world, right? Like true hermits that are out completely isolated and doing their practice. And, for them, that may be the most effective path. But I think you're right. And like we learn through most of us anyway learn through relation and through service to others through developing like you're saying the nurturing qualities and that doesn't necessarily need to be your actual family, right? That can be the monastic family as well. um, but I think going back to this idea that renunciation sometimes leads people to jump to this idea of kind of hermitage, like just being completely isolated. And so even when I show films of monastics to my students, they're like kind of surprised at how social they're being, or they're like the ways in which they seem just like kind of any other community, right? And so again, I think that the stubbornness of that perception is kind of what I'm grappling with. But I think it's a really good point to bring up that um, this idea of service and nurturing is another important part of it. Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Tori, this is Genjo. Appreciate your talk. Hi. See. Um, yeah, I really appreciate your talk and your framing of this and this bringing in this question that is seemingly opposed, but and once we kind of like you said unpack it, there's actually really nothing. There's actually nothing there in opposition. That's
Mhm.
been my um, but it's been interesting to ordain and then to just be living out this kind of question and seeing it unfold in my life. And when I told my family, my mom and my mom, my uncle, my auntie were there, my sisters, that I was going to ordain, the first thing that my mom asked was, "Am I still going to be your mother?" You know, and
Mm.
it was very tender. Um, and and then at the ceremony, of course, the way it's done in Zen, at least, I don't know how far back this goes or if it's practiced in other traditions, but there's a seat there for your mother and father. You know, they're really invited to be a part of that, to be a part of that ordination ceremony. So that's built in. Um, but it's been, I think you said it really beautifully of this talking about the Buddha and Shakyamuni Buddha and his relationships with his family is that there was a transformation there that happened. And I'm very much experiencing that, in my life. And it's interesting to be a part of and to be letting unfold. Um, and I recently read, I'm reading this book by Chosen Bays Roshi on Jizo Bodhisattva. And I can't remember who wrote the preface, but in it she's talking about this point that you often come to in your spiritual practice where you realize um, the importance of your parents, in a really deep way. There's almost this like karmic imbalance there that you're almost you feel this obligation almost to balance, and I'm thinking about what you brought in with Shakyamuni Buddha's mother, Queen Maya, and the vow that she made lifetimes ago, and the power of that vow, and that how ultimately, that led to her death. The story goes that either during childbirth or soon after she died. And I imagine she knew that was a part of it, you
Mhm.
know, but just that the I'm really that's really landing in me, that importance of that relationship, the relationship to our not only our parents but our siblings and all our ancestors, and how do we, I guess the question is, how do we honor that and bring that into our practice, whether we are monastics or householders, but what does that look like? So anyway, it spurred a lot of thoughts for me. I really appreciate you bringing this topic in,
Yeah.
because it's important and I don't think talked about enough.
Mm.
Appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Gosh, I got choked up listening to you talk about your mom's question. That is really tender and moving. And yeah, I think I uh, I also, not having had the experience of going through ordination, it's really valuable to hear how you're experiencing it. And this idea of transforming, not severing the ties, but transforming the ties, right? Is, I think, a really useful and powerful one. And yeah, in the volume Emergent Dharma, I didn't include this one as one that I briefly summarized, but Chen Sing Han has a really wonderful chapter that's about this exact idea you talk about with the sort of debt to our parents, this feeling of karmic debt to our parents, for bringing us into life, right, to be able to practice. And she grapples with that because, she talks about how that's not always the most natural feeling towards our parents, right? We may not always feel, for whatever reason, that natural kind of organic gratitude or that organic sense of indebtedness. That doesn't come easily for everyone for a variety of reasons. And she really unpacks that in a very authentic way. I don't know. It's an interesting one to read that I found really resonant. Um, because I think one thing I don't want to do is say that that the family life, that these family ties are uncomplicated, right? They're very complicated, and sometimes I think the idea for some might be that renunciation can be a refuge from relations, right? Like
Mm.
an escape from relations. And I think most people probably quickly learn not that doesn't work, but um but I think it does, sometimes it does lead people to the practice, right? This idea that they kind of want to sever. And but the if you take the idea of karma, seriously, you can't outrun these karmic ties, even if you can be away from the people that are embodied with those karmic ties, right? So, yeah, so I think the difficult aspects, I didn't really touch on them today, but there's some good stuff in the Emergent Dharma that talks about that. Thank you.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I'll make some announcements for the upcoming week or so. Um, Thank you again, Tori. That was a super awesome Dharma talk. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Um, okay, lots of stuff coming up. Super timely. Tomorrow there's family meditation. And the theme of tomorrow's family meditation is, I'm sorry, what is it, Mema?
Jizo.
Jizo. What does Jizo mean?
Jizo is a protector bodhisattva
Mm-hmm. Okay, got
who
you.
has the hats, the
Right.
statues with the hats that people in it.
Right.
Oh.
Got you. Okay, so that's the theme of tomorrow's family meditation. That's in person or on Zoom, and it's at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow. There will also be a full moon gathering, the pink full moon gathering on Wednesday, April 1st. That's also in person or Zoom, and that's at 7 p.m. Next weekend, there will be the April session, and it's being led by Reverend Chimio Atkinson, who ordained here and is very beloved. So it's going to be from April 3rd through 8th. So if you're interested, email me, I'll help you get registered. And then I just want to mention the family retreat is going to be June 12th through 14th. And so I think the theme of that is like peace and loving kindness. So there's going to be like some kind of activity related with that, and there's going to be like, yeah, lots of fun things to do. So I think like all ages are welcome. So if you or you know someone who would like to participate in the family retreat, again, email me, which is info@greattruetemple.org.
And the monk in that image and their child Pema, they're going to be there and
Yeah.
be like involved in like kind of guiding that in some ways. So
Yeah.
that'll be cool.
Daishin and his family will be there, which is awesome. Okay, I think that's kind of it. Anyone have any other announcements?
To close my story, I have a very close relationship with my mother. I saw her yesterday. I left that piece out. She's still my mother.
I assumed that.
Yeah, don't leave anything hanging.
No, I think I just
It's
yeah.
different.
Yeah, no, I didn't I did take your answer. I responded to you in a way that maybe painted it as if I was interpreting it that way. But no, I think I just meant to say that you know, that families and feelings, they're unpredictable and they can be wonderful and hard.
That's right.
That's
That's
so
right.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway,
All right, let's get back to merit.
may the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time. Thank you, Tori.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Cheers.